Welcome, dear listener. Come in and settle yourself for the evening. Let the day go. Whatever has been pulling at the edges of it, you can set it down now without looking back at it. Find a comfortable position and let your shoulders drop a little. Let your hands rest wherever they have fallen. Let your breathing slow in its own time, without any effort from you. The room around you is quiet. The night is patient. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing more you need to hold on to. Just this, the soft weight of the blanket, the hush of the air, and the slow, easy rhythm of your own breath. Take a moment. Let everything settle. The world outside is very far away, and it will still be there in the morning. For now, there is only this quiet, and you resting in the middle of it. Tonight we are going back, not to the grand rooms and gaslit parlours that we tend to picture when we think of Victorian London, not to the dinner tables set with silver, not to the drawing rooms with their heavy curtains and their careful arrangements of chairs. We are going to the other side of the house, through the baize door at the back of the entrance hall, down the narrow staircase that the family rarely used, along the stone-flagged passage, and into the kitchen, the scullery, the small and practical rooms where the real work of the household was done. Tonight we will spend a long, quiet evening in the company of the women who kept those houses running, more than 1 million of them, across Britain, in the years between 1850 and 1880, mostly young, mostly from the countryside, living in the upper and lower rooms of other people's houses, moving through grand corridors with their eyes down and their aprons clean, carrying everything the house required and leaving almost no trace of the carrying. They are not often in the history books. They have no portraits, but their world was real, and their days were long, and this evening we will sit with them for a while. We will walk the back stairs together. We will stand in the cold kitchen at 5 in the morning and watch the day begin. We will learn their hours and their small rituals and the particular customs of the world below stairs. Settle in. Let your eyes rest if they want to. The story begins very gently. In the spring of 1862, when the clerks at the General Register Office in London finished tabulating the returns from the previous year's census, they produced figures that captured something quite particular about the country they had just counted. Across England and Wales, on the night of the 7th of April 1861, 962,786 women had given their occupation as some form of domestic servant. Close to 1 million women. Within that number, the clerks could distinguish 102,000 housemaids, 78,000 cooks, 66,000 housekeepers, and a very large remainder, 644,000 women, who had simply written down the word servant without further description. When the male indoor servants were added, the butlers, the footmen, the valets, the male cooks and stewards, the total for what the census called the 5th order of occupations, the order of persons engaged in entertaining and performing personal services, came to 1,367,782 people. By some distance, one of the largest categories of paid work in the country, but not the largest. That distinction belonged to agricultural labor, which occupied an even greater number of working hands across the rural counties. Domestic service was the second pillar. Together, those two categories, the people who worked the land and the people who worked in the houses, accounted for the great majority of paid work in 19th century Britain, and the houses increasingly were in cities, and increasingly the largest concentration of those houses was in London. Almost 1 million women working in private homes across England and Wales. That figure is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells us something important about what the Victorian world actually was, as opposed to how it tends to be remembered. The same generation that built the railways and laid the transatlantic telegraph cable that sent its engineers to every corner of the empire, and its manufactured goods to every trading port on the globe. That confident, industrious Victorian world rested, in every practical daily sense, on the labor of young women who made the fires and carried the water and scrubbed the floors and served the meals in the private houses of the middle and upper classes. The extent of servant keeping in Victorian England would surprise most people today. We tend to imagine domestic servants as a luxury of the very wealthy, but a family living on 150 or 200 pounds a year, a schoolmaster, a clerk, a minor tradesman, was expected by the social standards of the time to employ at least one, not because they could easily afford to, but because not employing one was a visible social signal, a quiet evidence of insufficiency that polite Victorian society was not quite ready to forgive. Servant keeping was the visible proof that a household had crossed the line from laboring to respectable. The wage scale at the bottom of all this is documented. In 1879, when Charles Dickens Jr., the novelist's son, published his Dictionary of London, he gave the going annual rates for domestic servants in the city. A general servant, the maid of all work who did everything in a small household, earned between £6 and £15 a year, with bed and board included. A housemaid in a more substantial house earned 10 to 25, a parlour maid 12 to 30, a cook 18 to 50. The numbers had not changed dramatically since the 1860s. For comparison, a clerk in a respectable city office might earn 150 to 200 pounds, a skilled artisan perhaps 100. The maid of all work, on the lowest figure of £6 a year, earned roughly the price of 2 pairs of decent shoes per year, in money she could spend on herself. We from me once do white and dumps. In the morning she cleaned the grates and lit the fires and swept the front step before anyone else was up. She cooked breakfast and cleared it away and washed the crockery and made the beds and answered the door whenever anyone called. In the afternoon she did whatever else was required, mending, shopping, preparing the evening meal. In the evening she washed the dinner things and set the kitchen to rights and laid what was needed for the morning. Her day was 15 or 16 hours long, sometimes longer. The expectation of invisibility in this system was not merely metaphorical, it was built into the houses themselves. Grander Victorian houses were designed with 2 parallel circulations through the building, the main staircase and corridors for the family and their guests, and a secondary system of back stairs and service passages for the servants. These back routes were narrow, undecorated, unheated. They ran behind the walls of the main rooms, through the parts of the house that visitors never saw. The housemaid carrying coal up to the drawing room was expected to use the back stairs, appear briefly at the fireplace and disappear again, all without being noticed, all without leaving any visible trace of her presence except the replenished fire and the closed door. The architecture made the rule physical. There was no need to write down "use the back stairs," because the architecture had already written it. A new housemaid could be shown the building once, and the rules were at once legible. The back stairs are this way. The family stairs are that way. You belong here, and only there for a few minutes at a time. Humanität, a few minutes at a time. In households with the architecture to support this arrangement, there were understood rules about when servants could be in the main rooms and when they could not. Morning work, the cleaning of grates, the laying of fires, the dusting and polishing, was supposed to be completed before the family came downstairs. If a housemaid was caught still at work in the dining room when the family appeared at the door, it was a small failure, a lapse in the smooth running of the household. If a servant and a member of the family met unexpectedly on the front staircase, the expectation in many households was clear. The servant stepped to the side, lowered her eyes, and waited until the family member had passed. The particulars varied from house to house. The principle was consistent across many of them, and it was taught to girls new to service not through formal instruction necessarily, but through the practical correction of small errors. The first time a housemaid was found dusting in the front hall when a family member appeared, she learned the rule not from a manual, but from the tone of the housekeeper's voice. Service was absorbed through the daily experience of doing it, and through the slow process of understanding which errors mattered and which could be quietly overlooked. The advice literature of the time prescribed it as a goal. A well-trained servant should be barely perceptible. She should enter a room and perform her duties without disturbing the occupants. She should not initiate conversation with the family. She should not linger when her task was done. She should be in the spirit of the manuals, if not always in those exact words, present without being felt. Present without being felt. Those 4 words capture something essential about what Victorian domestic service asked of women. They asked for presence that was constant, reliable, and total, and at the same time for the complete suppression of any personal claim on the space. The women who managed this most naturally, who could be in a room without disturbing it, who could read the mood of the household the way a barometer reads the weather, who knew when the mistress wished to be spoken to and when she did not. Those were the women who advanced through the ranks of service, who stayed long in good positions, who earned the trust that occasionally expressed itself in a kind word in a reference letter or a small legacy left in a will. In the census records of the 1860s, many of these women appear by first name only, their surnames absent or imprecisely recorded, their ages sometimes approximate. They are identified by function: cook, housemaid, parlour-maid, nurse, laundry-maid. The function was what the record was designed to capture. The names that surface carry a quiet geography. Anne from Somersetshire, Mary from County Clare, Eliza from a village in Norfolk whose parish records show her baptized in the same church as her mother and her grandmother before her. They came to the city young, many of them between 14 and 18, because there was steady work there, and because a situation in a good household offered something that irregular agricultural labor in the countryside did not: a roof, a bed, 3 meals a day, and references that might carry them forward. Almost 1 million women in a single decade, in a single country, second only to the workforce of the fields. The figure stands in the historical record the way a large and quiet monument stands, not dramatic in itself, but large enough that once you have seen it, you cannot quite look at the rest of the picture the same way again. What they took away from it varied enormously. Some women spent their whole working lives in service, rising slowly through its ranks, ending as cook or housekeeper in households where they were genuinely valued and quietly indispensable. Others left after a year or two for factory work or shop work or marriage and never looked back. Some recalled service as the hardest and most confining time of their lives. Others remembered the kitchen of a particular house with a kind of fondness that surprised them when they returned to it in memory. The warmth of a specific range, the smell of a particular polish, the sound of the bells, the texture of the days, the feel of firelight through a thick apron on a cold morning, the particular quality of silence in a large house at 6 o'clock on a weekday before the bells began, the weight of a full water jug on the back stairs. Small things, but dense with the particular weight of what is actually lived. Now imagine the scene a little more clearly. The servants' hall at the back of a London townhouse, a long table with benches, a clock on the wall, and a row of bells above the door, each one labelled with the name of a room. The bells are quiet for the moment, but the table tells a story of its own. There is a particular order to who sits where, and that order, in the world below stairs, matters a great deal. At the long table in the servants' hall, the seating was never random. If you had walked in on a Tuesday evening in a well-run London household of the 1860s, you would have found the servants assembled for their supper in an order that mirrored, quite precisely, the order of rank that governed every aspect of their working day. At the head of the table, presiding over the meal with quiet authority, sat the housekeeper. At the other end, if the household were large enough to have one, sat the butler. Between them, the rest of the indoor staff arranged themselves in a hierarchy as carefully structured as any institution the Victorians had devised, and they had devised a considerable number of institutions. The household servants' world was, at its most organized, a world of ranks and titles and defined responsibilities that left very little room for ambiguity. In a large establishment, the kind that occupied a whole house in Mayfair, or a country house with 10 or 12 indoor servants, the positions were clearly named and the boundaries between them clearly maintained. The scullery maid occupied the lowest position of all. She worked in the scullery, the wet and cold room off the kitchen, washing pots and pans and kitchen implements, preparing vegetables, carrying out the heavy and unglamorous work that kept the kitchen running. She was usually young, often new to service, and in many households she ate her meals separately from the rest of the staff, or after them. In some households there was a position with a name that captured its peculiar awkwardness. The between maid, or, in the slightly later phrase that entered the language around 1890, The tweenie. She was a junior maid whose duties were divided between 3 department heads, the housekeeper, the butler, and the cook, and so she answered to all 3, and was caught between their differing demands. The very word tweenie came from this in-between status. Her position was roughly equivalent to that of a scullery maid. Her wages were sometimes lower, because no one of her 3 masters quite owned her. In some accounts she was also called the hall girl, because one of her duties was waiting at table in the servants' hall. Above the scullery maid and the tweenie came the kitchen maid, who assisted the cook with the actual preparation of food. Above her the cook herself, who in a good household was a figure of real authority and genuine skill. In 1879, when Charles Dickens Jr. published his Dictionary of London, he listed the going annual wages for indoor servants. A cook, he wrote, earned £18 to £50 a year. That figure is worth lingering on. It puts the cook above the footman, who earned 20 to 40, and well above the housemaid and the parlour maid, at 10 to 25 and 12 to 30 respectively. In a respectable middle-class household, the cook was often the highest-paid woman in the building, and one of the most powerful people below stairs. She purchased supplies from butchers and grocers, planned menus a week or more in advance, trained her assistants, and answered to the mistress for the daily cost of feeding everyone in the house. A family that had a good cook tended to keep her, and to overlook the small irregularities of temperament that often came with professional skill. There was also, in many cooks' lives, a quietly understood economy on the side. Cooks could legitimately sell the dripping fat from roasted meats, the bones from the kitchen, even the empty tins and jars, to the dealers who collected them. These were the kitchen perquisites, the perks. There was, in addition, in many establishments, a tacit custom by which the cook claimed a commission of 1 shilling per pound, 5%, on the bills paid through her to butchers, grocers, and other tradesmen. The tradesmen knew it. The mistress sometimes knew it and chose not to know it formally. It was the cook's de facto compensation for the relatively modest formal wages, and it was one of the reasons a successful cook could, over years, accumulate quite a substantial sum of her own money. The housemaids occupied a parallel hierarchy. The under-housemaid did the heavy cleaning, the grates, the floors, the carrying of coal and water. The upper housemaid was responsible for the bedrooms and the principal rooms of the house, for making beds and dusting and maintaining the appearance of the spaces the family actually used. In larger households, a parlour maid handled the drawing room and the entrance hall and the answering of the door. Her work was more visible than the housemaid's, her dress correspondingly neater, her manner expected to be a little more polished. Above all the housemaids and below the housekeeper stood the lady's maid, whose position was particular and in certain ways privileged. She waited on the mistress of the household directly, helping her dress and undress, maintaining her wardrobe, attending her on journeys, arranging her hair. She was in constant close proximity to the family in a way that the other domestic servants were not, and this gave her a kind of reflected status that was at once an advantage and a complication. At the top of the female hierarchy stood the housekeeper. She was, in any household large enough to employ one, one of the most important people in the building. She held the keys, literally held them, on a ring at her waist, to the store cupboard, the linen closet, the larder, and in many households the wine cellar as well. She ordered supplies, managed the household accounts, directed the work of the female staff, interviewed potential new servants, and served as the daily point of contact between the family and the domestic workforce below stairs. A good housekeeper was invaluable. A poor one could bring considerable disorder to a household in a matter of weeks. The housekeeper was addressed as Mrs. regardless of whether she was married or had ever been married. This was a courtesy title, a recognition of her authority and her position, and it was universally observed. A girl who had been in service for 20 years and had never married might be called Mrs. Henderson or Mrs. Clark as naturally as if she had a husband waiting for her at home. The title was not about marital status, it was about rank. The same convention applied in many households to the cook, who was also addressed by the staff as Mrs. Junior servants addressed senior servants by their title. In a very formal establishment, the lady's maid and the valet, as the personal servants of the family, might be addressed by the other servants using the surname of their employer. A lady's maid who served Lady Ashworth might be called Miss Ashworth by the lower servants, a strange doubling that underlined the peculiar reflected status of those who served the family most closely. At meal times the hierarchy was enacted in miniature. In some larger households the upper servants did not eat their entire meal in the servants' hall. They assembled instead in the housekeeper's private sitting room, known by the lower servants with affectionate disrespect as Pug's Parlour. The nickname is said to have referred to the housekeeper's morose and disapproving expression, the kind of face a small flat-nosed dog might wear. From there the upper servants would walk together into the servants' hall for the main course of the meal, led in by the butler, a procession the lower servants also had a name for. They called it Pug's Parade. The senior pudding course was sometimes taken back in Pug's Parlour afterward, with the lower servants left to their own conversation in the hall below. This has a quality that might seem, from outside, faintly absurd, the careful reproduction, in the basement and the back quarters, of the same social distinctions that govern the world upstairs. But it was not absurd to the people who lived it. Rank below stairs was not a parody of rank above stairs. It was its own system, with its own logic and its own slang, and for the women who worked within it, the distinction between being a kitchen maid and being a housemaid was not a small thing. It was the difference between wet floors and dry ones, between heavy pots and light dusters, between a position that might lead somewhere and one that might not. To move up the hierarchy, a maid had to demonstrate reliability, competence, and a sufficient degree of good character, a phrase that the Victorians applied with great seriousness and some imprecision to a cluster of qualities that included honesty, sobriety, willingness to work, and the absence of any behavior that might embarrass the household. The movement upward was slow and not guaranteed. A girl who entered service at 14 as a tweenie or a scullery maid might spend several years in that position before a vacancy opened above her. She watched and she waited, and she learned the work of the rank above hers by watching the person who held it. When the vacancy came, if it came, she would be ready, and so as the supper in the servants' hall drew to its close, and the clock on the wall moved toward 8 o'clock, and the housekeeper folded her napkin and rose from her chair, each servant at the table rose slightly with her, a small automatic gesture of deference that they had long since stopped noticing themselves performing. The hall was cleared, the day continued, and somewhere in the kitchen, a young woman in a rough cotton dress was still at the sink, her hands red from the water, her mind quiet, the sound of the house settling around her in the particular way that large houses settle when the evening is coming on. Picture this: the front of the same house, upstairs, the drawing room fire banked, and the family at their books or their needlework, entirely unaware of the particular order of the table in the room below their feet, the two worlds running side by side as they did every evening, quiet and parallel, and almost entirely separate. And in the morning, before any of these worlds had fully woken, the cycle would begin again. The attic room, at 4:30 in the morning, was cold in a way that nothing else in the house was cold. The warmth of the range 3 floors below did not reach the slates. In winter, frost formed inside the glass of the small window that looked out over the rooftops. The housemaid who slept in that room had learned, in her first weeks in service, the particular discipline of leaving the bed quickly, because the longer you lay in it after the bell rang, the small alarm clock on the floor usually, since clocks were one of the few things a maid was expected to provide for herself, the harder it became to leave it at all. The first movement of the day was always the same. She would dress in the dark, or nearly so, in her rough cotton morning dress and heavy apron, saving the white cap and afternoon dress for later, when there was a chance the family might see her. She would take her candle, a tallow candle, not a good wax one, since tallow was cheaper and perfectly sufficient for the back quarters, and she would make her way down the back stairs to the kitchen. The kitchen range in a Victorian household was not simply a stove. It was the central organ of the building. Everything depended on it: hot water for washing and bathing, heat for cooking, warmth for the kitchen itself on cold mornings. It was cast iron, usually large, and it required daily attention. Every morning it had to be cleaned of the previous day's ash, the flues cleared, the iron surfaces rubbed with a paste called black lead, a graphite-based polish that gave the iron a deep satin sheen and protected it from rust. The black lead was not, despite its alarming name, an arsenical compound. It was a mineral graphite paste, messy but not poisonous. That distinction would matter elsewhere in the house, in a way the maid who carried her cleaning brushes from room to room could hardly have known. Once the range was tended and the fire revived from its overnight embers, the water had to be set on to boil. This was not the simple matter it might appear. In most Victorian houses of the middle and upper middle class, there was no running hot water above the ground floor. The water that the family used for washing each morning, for the basins and jugs in the bedrooms, had to be heated in the kitchen and carried upstairs by hand. A copper jug of hot water, heavy enough that it took both hands to carry safely up 2 or 3 flights of stairs, set outside each bedroom door before the family woke. This was one of the defining physical tasks of Victorian domestic service. It required strength, steadiness, and an ability to move quickly without making noise. The coal was another matter. Every fireplace in the house had to be set and lit before the family came downstairs. In a townhouse of moderate size, this might mean 4 or 5 fireplaces, the dining room, the drawing room, the morning room if there was one, the master's study. Each required a coal scuttle carried up from the cellar, a hearth swept and cleaned of yesterday's ash, new paper and kindling and coal set correctly for a clean light, the fire struck and coaxed to a reliable burn, and the hearth swept once more around the base. In winter, all of this had to be done by candlelight on cold floors before 6 in the morning. Then came the dusting. The Victorian drawing room, more than any other room in the house, was densely furnished and densely decorated. Heavy patterned wallpaper, often in vivid colors, curtains, runners, doilies, framed prints, ornaments, vases, picture frames, all of it gathered dust. All of it had to be wiped, beaten, lifted, and set down again every morning. And here is where the particular hidden hazard of the Victorian house comes into view, because the maid raising dust at 6 in the morning was raising dust that in a great many fashionable households was actually poisonous. In 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele had created a vivid emerald green pigment by combining copper and arsenic. Scheele's green was unprecedentedly bright, durable, and cheap. By the 1840s, when British wallpaper production began to expand dramatically, driven by the repeal of the paper tax and the introduction of machine printing, Scheele's green and its arsenical successor, Paris green, became the fashionable colors of the period. Drawing rooms and bedrooms across middle and upper middle class London were papered in arsenical greens. The color was beautiful. It was also poisonous. The poison was released in several ways. The pigment flaked off the paper as it aged, and the dust settled on every surface in the room. Damp conditions allowed the arsenic, in combination with mold in the wallpaper paste, to release a toxic gas, a phenomenon proved later in the century by an Italian chemist named Bartolomeo Gossio. The result was that anyone who spent time in such a room, and especially anyone whose work involved disturbing its surfaces every morning, was being slowly exposed. In 1862, in Limehouse, in the East End of London, 4 young children of one family died, one after another, after sharing a room papered in Scheele's green. The deaths caused public outcry. Newspapers reported on the case, doctors testified, and yet arsenical wallpaper remained in millions of British homes for decades after the warning. The color was still beautiful. The science was contested. The wallpaper was already up. For the housemaid dusting that drawing room every morning, the danger was small but constant. Skin eruptions, stomach upsets, headaches that came and went. She would not have known the chemistry. She would only have known that some houses gave her a kind of malaise she could not quite name, and other houses did not. The cleaning agents she actually held in her hands were a small chemistry of their own. and most of them were milder than the wallpaper she was dusting. Vinegar for windows, beeswax and turpentine for furniture, soda and soap for floors, whiting, a fine chalk powder for silver and lighter metalwork, salt and lemon for stains on linen. A maid carried in her head a working knowledge of which substance to use on which surface, and what would damage what, and how much was the right amount for the job at hand. She had not been taught any of this in school, because she had probably left school by 12 or 13. She had learned it in the kitchen by doing it under correction until the knowledge was practical and unconscious. The cleaning itself followed a prescribed order that the manuals of the period were very clear about. You worked from top to bottom, from far to near, from dirty to clean, sweeping before dusting, always, because dust raised by the broom settled on the surfaces you had not yet reached, polishing the grate only after the ash had been removed, setting the fire only after the hearthrug had been taken up and beaten. The order was not arbitrary. It was the accumulated wisdom of many years of domestic work, passed from housekeeper to housemaid, from experienced servant to new girl, in the practical and daily language of the job. The smells of the early morning in a Victorian kitchen were particular and unmistakable: blacklead and coal ash, strong tea as soon as the kettle was up, bread from the day before, the faint iron smell of the range itself as it warmed. In summer, sometimes, a coolness from the garden or the yard that found its way through the scullery window. In winter, the cold that clung to everything until the range had been going for an hour and the kitchen had properly warmed. These were the first things of the day, before the bells began, before the house stirred, before the long sequence of service that would carry the maid through until 10 at night. By 7 o'clock, in most households, the servants themselves would have taken breakfast, a brief, informal meal in the kitchen or the servants' hall, eaten quickly and without ceremony. Tea, bread, perhaps dripping or a scraping of butter. It was not a long break. The family's breakfast had to be ready by 8 or past, and there was still work to do between now and then. The dining room to be set, the sideboard laid, the silver to be checked, the morning newspapers, by some accounts, in the more fastidious households, pressed lightly with a warm iron so that their freshly printed ink would not transfer to the master's gloves and upholstery. By the time the family appeared at the breakfast table, brushed and dressed and ready for the day, the maid who had been at work since 4:30 had already put in 3½ or 4 hours. She had laid their fire, warmed their water, set their table, and made their breakfast. She had done it quietly, efficiently, and largely unseen. And the morning, as far as the family was concerned, had simply arrived in its accustomed condition. And so as the clocks in the hall struck 8, and the smell of toast and coffee drifted through the house, somewhere below and behind, in the warm and smoky kitchen, the work of the day was already well underway. The range was going steadily, the pots were stacked, the bells above the door waited, patient and quiet, for the first ring of the morning. Back in the passageway now, behind the green baize door, can you hear them? The bells, when they rang, had a sound that every maid learned to know by heart, not just as noise, but as a language, and the system that summoned her by ringing them was, in its quiet way, one of the technologies that had made the whole architecture of Victorian invisibility possible in the first place. Above the door of the servants' hall, or in the passage just outside the kitchen, there hung in most Victorian houses of any size a board of small bells. They were set in a row, each one suspended on a curved spring of metal, each one labelled with a small painted or printed name beneath it: drawing room, dining room, master's study, morning room, best spare bedroom. Each bell was connected by a wire running through the walls and under the floors of the house to a pull somewhere in the room it named, a handle or a knob set into the wall, or sometimes a decorative rope hanging near the fireplace. When someone in that room pulled the handle, the wire tightened, the spring flexed, and the bell in the corridor below swung on its bracket and rang. The bellboard was one of the defining technologies of Victorian domestic life, and it was not as simple to operate as it might appear. When a bell rang, it continued to vibrate on its spring for several seconds after the initial pull, and a trained servant could tell, from the quality and duration of that vibration, not only which room had rung, but sometimes something about the nature of the summons. A single brisk pull meant come now. A more tentative pull meant come when convenient. Multiple pulls meant come at once, and do not stop to tidy your apron on the way. Before the bell systems, a household summoned its servants by voice, a call from the top of the stairs, a shout down a passage, a hand clap in the hall. The development of the wire and spring bell, which arrived gradually through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was one of the small but real technological transformations of domestic life. It allowed the family upstairs to summon a servant from anywhere in the house without raising a voice or leaving a chair. It was, in its way, an instrument of a particular kind of comfort, the comfort of being able to call without calling, to demand without speaking, to bring another person into the room simply by reaching for a cord. But the first skill for the maid below was simply learning which bell was which. In a house with 10 or 12 rooms and a full staff, this was not always as straightforward as it sounds. The bells were labelled, but in the noise and urgency of a busy afternoon they looked similar, and they moved together when one was disturbed. A new housemaid might spend her first weeks in service making notes in her mind, a small private geography of the board, cross-referenced with the geography of the house above. The drawing-room bell had a slightly different sound to the dining-room bell. The spare bedroom bell vibrated a little longer. She learned these distinctions the way a musician learns the notes on a keyboard, by repetition, by attention, by the slow accumulation of experience until the knowledge became instinct. The installation of bell systems in domestic houses had begun in the late 18th century and had expanded steadily through the Victorian period. By the 1840s and 1850s, any London townhouse built or substantially renovated for a family of moderate means was expected to have them. The wires ran through channels cut in the plaster, down through the floors, and along the service passages to the board in the servants' quarters. Maintaining this system was a periodic task, the The wires stretched over time, the springs weakened, the connections loosened, and in a well-run household, the bell system was checked regularly to ensure that every bell reached its destination reliably and that no wire had been accidentally interrupted by a piece of furniture moved against the wall. By the 1860s and 1870s, some more modern houses had installed speaking tubes alongside or in place of the bells. These were pipes built into the walls with a small whistle mouthpiece at each end, through which a voice could travel from one room to another. You whistled into the tube to signal that you wanted to speak, waited for the whistle to return from the other end to indicate that someone was listening, and then spoke your message. The speaking tube was considered a refinement, a more direct and communicative technology than the bell, and households that had them often still kept the bells as well for routine summoning. The tube was for when the bell was not quite enough. The speaking tube had its own etiquette. The whistle that signaled the beginning of a conversation was a small breathy note, made by blowing into the mouthpiece. The whistle returning from the other end meant that someone had taken hold of the tube and was prepared to listen. The conversation itself was meant to be brief, practical, and limited to specific instructions or questions. A speaking tube used for casual chatter was a speaking tube being used incorrectly, and most households were quite firm about the distinction. For the maid answering a bell, the moment between hearing it ring and presenting herself at the room it named was brief and purposeful. She had to stop whatever she was doing, note which bell had rung, consider what it was likely to want, and arrive at the door of the relevant room in a state of readiness and composure. A housemaid arriving breathless and flushed was a housemaid who had not managed her time well. A housemaid who appeared calmly, apron clean and cap straight, within the expected interval, a minute or two, sometimes less for a sharp, insistent ring, was a housemaid who was doing her job correctly. There was a particular rhythm to the day's bells in a household running smoothly. The first bell of the morning, around 9, when a member of the family rang for hot water or for the curtains to be drawn. The breakfast room bell shortly after, a flurry around 11 when the morning post arrived and instructions were issued, a quiet middle of the day, the lunch bell, the afternoon bells for visitors and for tea, the dressing bell before dinner, the dinner bell, and the after-dinner bells for coffee and for the bringing of cards or books to the drawing room. By a kind of unconscious accumulation, the maid came to know the day's likely pattern and to anticipate which bell was likely to ring next, even before it did. The bell governed the rhythm of the day in a way that was both practical and deeply symbolic. It said, "You are available, you are on call. Whatever you are doing, when I ring, you come." In households where there were 3 or 4 servants, this was manageable. The bells rang perhaps a dozen times in a day, at predictable intervals, around the family's meals and movements. In households where there was only a single maid of all work, the bell was an additional layer of interruption over a day that was already fully occupied. She heard it ring while she was in the middle of something else, and she stopped that something else and went. There was a bell that rang more rarely than the others, but that carried a particular weight when it did, the night bell. This was the bell, or the bell pull, in the master bedroom or the mistress's dressing room, if it rang after the household had gone to sleep, which meant in practice after the servants had finally gone to bed, it meant that someone needed something in the night, and someone had to get up and go. The housemaid or the lady's maid, depending on the household, would light her candle, make herself presentable, and descend the back stairs once more into the dark and quiet house. The night bell could mean several things. It could mean a child was unwell. It could mean the master had returned late and wanted brandy. It could mean that the mistress could not sleep and wished for warm milk. It could mean a window had been heard to rattle in a wind and someone wanted the matter checked. The maid did not know, when she rose, which of these she was rising for. She dressed quickly, lit her candle, and went. The experience of the night bell, the sudden shock of the alarm after an hour or two of sleep, the effort of waking fully and quickly, the cold stairs and the closed rooms, was one of the less comfortable aspects of service that the advice manuals tended to describe matter-of-factly, as though the interruption of sleep was simply another element of the job to be managed with good grace. The maid who answered the night bell without complaint, who appeared promptly and without visible irritation, who dealt with whatever was required and returned to her bed without making the episode into a grievance, that maid was doing what was asked of her, and then the board would settle again. The bell would hang still on its spring, the passage would quiet, the house would resume its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere near the top of the building, the maid would climb back into her narrow bed and lie listening to the house breathe around her, wondering, perhaps, whether she would make it to 4:30 before the next bell rang. Meanwhile, in another corner of the same house, the question of what a maid wore through all of this, to the range at 5 in the morning, to the drawing room at noon, and to the night bell at midnight, was itself a system with its own rules, its own signals, its own careful gradations of meaning, and it began with the dress that was put on in the dark. A Victorian maid wore 2 different uniforms in the course of a single day, and the change between them was not simply a matter of personal preference or domestic custom. It was a signal directed both at the household and at the world about what kind of work was being done and in what part of the house she was doing it. In the morning hours, when the work was heavy and dirty, the grates, the ranges, the coal, the floors, the fires, she wore what was called the morning dress. This was a practical garment made of strong cotton in a dark color, brown or blue or a deep gray, that would not show the black lead and ash and coal dust of the early work. Over it she wore a rough apron, usually coarser linen or a thick cotton, large enough to cover most of the dress and tied firmly at the back. The fabric of the morning dress was usually a heavy cotton or a printed cotton calico, sturdy and washable, and stripes and small checks were popular for it, because they hid the inevitable splashes of soot and grease far better than a plain color did. The morning apron was almost always made of unbleached linen or sacking, coarse and thick, durable to a degree that the better aprons were not. It absorbed water, withstood scrubbing, and could be boiled in the laundry copper without losing its shape. By afternoon, when the heavy work was done, When the fires were laid and the rooms set to rights and the morning's cleaning completed, the morning dress was changed. In its place she put on her afternoon dress, black typically, or a dark navy in some households, a closer fitting and better made garment that said to anyone who saw her, "The coarse work is finished, and I am presenting myself in the part of the house where I may be observed." Over it went a fresh white apron, crisply starched, smaller and more ornamental than the morning apron, and on her head the white cap. The white cap was a small and seemingly simple object that carried a considerable amount of meaning. The cap said, "I am in service. I am not the mistress of this house. I am here to work." It was a uniform element that marked the wearer's function as clearly as any badge or label. To put one on at the start of the working hours was, in a quite literal sense, to enter the costume of the role. To take it off at the end of the day, on the half day off, when leaving the house, was to step out of the costume again. The cap was a small object that worked like a switch. In some households, the style of the cap was specified by the employer with considerable exactness. The width of the frill, the depth of the back, the angle at which it should be worn, these details were sometimes set out in the household's unwritten rules and enforced through the housekeeper's supervision. A maid who appeared with her cap at the wrong angle, or with a cap that had not been properly laundered and starched, was making a visible error. The cap was, among other things, a test of standards. The standard against which all of this was measured had, by the 1860s, an extraordinary and rather remarkable origin. In October of 1861, a London publisher brought out, in a single handsome-bound volume, a book that had been appearing in monthly parts for the previous 2 years, Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. It was over 1,000 pages long. It contained recipes, household budgets, cleaning schedules, child-rearing advice, medical advice, descriptions of every servant's role and proper conduct, model wage tables, and detailed prescriptions for the proper running of a respectable middle-class home. It sold 60,000 copies in its first year. It became very quickly the household management Bible of an entire generation, the book the mistress of a new household consulted when she needed to know what was expected of her and of her servants and of every detail of the home she was running. The author was a young woman named Isabella Beeton. She had started writing it at the age of 21. She compiled the recipes from contributions sent in by readers of her husband's magazine and the household advice from her own experience and her own reading of earlier domestic guides. The book that defined Victorian domestic standards for generations was put together, page by page, by a woman in her early 20s, and Isabella Beeton would not live to see what her book became. She died on the 6th of February 1865 of puerperal fever, the bacterial infection that killed thousands of women in childbirth in the era before antibiotics, after the birth of her 4th child. She was 28 years old. The book that taught a generation of British mistresses how to run a household for the rest of the century was the work of a woman who never reached the age of 30. Beeton's book set out in considerable detail what every servant should wear and how she should wear it. The morning uniforms and the afternoon uniforms were specified by category. The cap was prescribed. The whole structure of dress and apron and cap that the maid put on each morning had been formalized, in part by the prose of a young woman who, while writing it, had only just emerged from being a young bride herself. The mistress on the upper floors who consulted the book each morning, and the maid on the back stairs who lived inside its prescriptions, were both in a sense governed by the careful pen of a 20-something writer who had died before either of them had truly begun their working lives in that household. Maids were generally not permitted to wear their own clothes during working hours. This was not always made explicit as a rule, like many of the regulations governing domestic service. It was simply understood, but it was consistently enforced. Personal clothing was for the time off, the precious Sunday afternoon, the rare full day away from the house. While in service, the servant wore the uniform. The uniform was either provided by the household, which was the practice in larger and better off establishments, or it was the maid's own responsibility to provide, in which case she might receive a small annual sum, a clothing allowance, to help with the cost. Either way, it was not her choice in any personal sense. It was the job's clothing. It belonged in some ways to the role. All of the personal possessions that a maid actually owned, the few extra items of clothing for her days off, any small keepsakes or letters or books, her own hairbrush and pins, whatever small objects she had brought with her from her previous life, were stored in a single wooden chest. This was the box bed chest, or simply the box, and it lived at the foot of her bed in the attic room. It was usually not large. A girl entering service at 14 often carried everything she owned from her previous home in a bundle that fitted inside it comfortably. Over the years, as she saved a little and occasionally received gifts, it might become more full, but it remained, throughout her working life, the boundary of her personal space. Everything that was hers, in a house that was not hers, lived in that box. What a maid wore also announced her rank within the household. In a large establishment where there were several ranks of female servant, the differences were often visible. The parlour maid, who worked in the principal rooms and answered the front door, wore a smarter afternoon dress and a more elaborate cap than the kitchen maid, who was rarely seen upstairs at all. The lady's maid, who was closest to the family, might be allowed to dress in a way that reflected the family's taste and social position, her clothes more stylish, her cap smaller and less conspicuous, her overall appearance calibrated to do credit to the mistress she accompanied on social calls. Stockings and shoes were typically the maid's own responsibility. Black wool stockings in winter, lighter cotton in summer, sturdy black leather shoes that had to be polished daily. A maid who polished her own shoes alongside the family's was performing a small additional task that the household did not always notice. A pair of good shoes, properly cared for, could last a maid for several years. A pair allowed to deteriorate became a constant small worry. The cost of replacement, weighed against the few pounds of yearly wages, was not negligible. For the woman who wore them, The uniforms were simply clothes. They were what you put on in the morning and took off at night. But they were also, in the way of all uniforms, a kind of argument. They argued that the wearer was not herself in this context, but a function, that the particular woman inside the white cap and the black afternoon dress was, during these hours, subordinate to the role that Mrs. Beeton's pages had so confidently set out on laundry day, which was Monday in most respectable households, an enormous and exhausting weekly event that occupied the kitchen and scullery and backyard from before dawn to after dark. The morning aprons and afternoon aprons and caps were boiled and starched and hung to dry along whatever lines were available, indoors in winter, in the backyard in summer when the air would take them. Clean linen was the visible mark of a well-managed household, and the maid who appeared on Tuesday morning in a fresh starched cap and apron was advertising, in a quiet way, that the household standards had been kept, and in the quiet room where she slept, in the box at the foot of the narrow bed, the small collection of her own things waited patiently for Sunday afternoon. A folded shawl, a small Bible perhaps, a few letters in a string, a hairbrush, a photograph in some boxes of a mother or a sister or a young man, the objects of a self that the day did not quite have room for. But behind all the practical arrangements of dress and rank and the daily rhythms of the household, there was one thing that governed a maid's life more than the cap or the apron or the prescriptions of any manual, one document, small in size and enormous in consequence, and without it the uniform and the experience and all the careful years of service counted for very little. The story does not end here. It continues in the particular power of a single letter written in someone else's hand about a life that was not their own. In the world of Victorian domestic service, there was a document that every maid needed, and that no law required her employer to provide. It was called the character, or the character letter, and it was a written statement from a previous employer testifying to the servant's honesty, reliability, sobriety, and general moral conduct. Without one, finding a new position in domestic service was nearly impossible. With a lukewarm or ambiguous one, it was not much easier. The character letter was the gate through which every servant had to pass each time she moved from one household to another, and the person who held the key to that gate was the employer she was leaving. The letter was typically short, a few sentences, sometimes a paragraph, sometimes less. It confirmed the servant's name, the length of her time in the household, her position, and then offered some assessment of her character: honest, sober, willing, a good worker. These were the necessary words, and their presence or absence was decisive. An employer who wrote that a maid was honest and hard-working was opening a door. An employer who wrote that she was satisfactory in some respects, but had given notice without adequate warning, or that she was not always punctual, was as good as closing one. The typical wording of a positive character was formulaic in a way that experienced employers and experienced servants both recognized. Mary Smith was in my service for 2 years and 4 months as a housemaid. She was honest, sober, willing, and a good worker. She left at her own request, and I am glad to recommend her to any household. That was the basic shape, in slight variations, of a useful letter. Departures from the formula were significant. The omission of sober, for instance, was noticed. The phrase left at her own request versus left by mutual agreement carried different implications. A reader who knew how to read these small signals could derive considerable information from a few short sentences. Servants themselves became expert readers of this code, often more expert than the employers writing the letters realized. The power this gave employers over the working lives of their servants was considerable, and it was not always exercised with great care or consistency. An employer who disliked a servant personally, or who had quarreled with her on her way out the door, could write a character that reflected the quarrel rather than the years of service. An employer who simply wished to discourage a servant from leaving a comfortable position might delay in writing the character until it was almost too late. An employer who refused to write one at all was not breaking any law. There was no legal requirement to provide a reference, and there was no formal appeal process for a servant who felt she had been treated unfairly. There were occasional court cases through the Victorian period that touched on the question of references, and the law that emerged from them was clear and unfavorable to servants. An employer could not be sued for refusing to write a character. An employer could in theory be sued for writing a knowingly false and malicious one, but the legal threshold was high. The costs of bringing such a case were beyond almost any servant's means, and the practical likelihood of any servant successfully challenging her former employer in court was vanishingly small. The law, in this matter as in many others, sat behind the household's existing arrangement and quietly upheld it. There was also the practice in some households of giving what was called a verbal character, a brief conversation at the back door between the housekeeper of the leaving household and a representative of the receiving one. Verbal characters were less formal than written ones, more easily denied, and more open to nuance. The shrug, the slight pause, the "I would not say a word against her" that meant exactly the opposite. These communicated information that no letter could put into words. For maids whose written characters were borderline, or whose previous employers were known for being severe, the verbal character was sometimes the only honest reference they could obtain. The things that could result in no character at all were well understood by every woman in service, and the knowledge sat beneath the ordinary working day, like a stone beneath shallow water. Dishonesty was the obvious one. A maid suspected or convicted of theft from the household would not receive a character, and was, in practical terms, finished in domestic service. Drink was another. A servant who was found to have been drinking from the household supplies, or who arrived at her duties in a state that suggested she had been drinking from her own, was dismissed without a character in most households, and the fact would be known at any registry office she subsequently approached. But the circumstance that was most feared and most devastating in its consequences was pregnancy outside marriage. A servant found to be pregnant or suspected of it was dismissed without notice and without a character in virtually every household of any standing. This was not a secret rule or an exceptional response. It was the understood standard, the thing that every girl entering service was made aware of, directly or indirectly, from her first weeks in the job. The moral requirements of the Victorian household extended to the private lives of its servants in a way that they did not extend to the family upstairs, whose privacy was protected by social convention and the general reluctance to look too closely at the lives of one's betters. For the maid dismissed in this way, the consequences were severe. Without a character, she could not obtain a position in another household of any respectability. Without income, she could not support herself and a child. The routes available to her were few, and most of them led away from the life she had known. Some women in this situation turned to charitable institutions, which existed in considerable numbers in Victorian London, and which offered practical help alongside a good deal of moral instruction. Others found their way to factory work or piecework, where the demand for a character was less acute. Others simply disappeared into the city's unrecorded layers. The character letter had also given rise to an institution that sat at the intersection of service and commerce: the registry office. Registry offices, forerunners of the modern employment agency, were places where servants seeking positions and households seeking servants could be brought together. A servant would present herself at the office, give her name and previous positions, and produce her character letter if she had one. The office kept records and made introductions, and charged a fee to one or both parties for the service. A servant with a strong character and a clear record in good households was a commodity in this market, and she knew it. A servant without a character had nothing to offer the office except her presence, and that was rarely enough. The better registry offices in London were known by name and by reputation among both servants and employers. A handful of well-regarded firms scattered across the West End, particularly clustered in Marylebone and around Soho, that had been operating for years, and that careful mistresses returned to whenever a position needed filling. The waiting rooms in these offices on a Monday morning were crowded with women in their plain afternoon dresses and good bonnets, sitting on benches with their characters folded carefully in their reticules, waiting for the clerk to call them through. The atmosphere was decorous and slightly tense. Each woman was at that moment between positions, between the comfort of a known household and the uncertainty of a new one, and the time spent in the waiting room was a kind of liminal space that everyone in it understood. The interviews themselves were brief and pointed. The clerk asked questions and the servant answered them. Where had she been in service? For how long? In what position? What were her wages? Why was she leaving? The character letter was produced and inspected. Notes were made in a ledger. If the servant was suitable, the clerk would mention a position that was currently being sought and arrange for her to call on the prospective employer at a specified time. If not, she was thanked politely and sent on her way to try another office or another approach. For the maid who had a good character, the letter was a form of portable reputation, carried carefully folded in her wooden chest alongside her few other papers. She would have read it many times usually, and she knew its words. She knew what it said and what it did not say, what praise it offered and what it conspicuously omitted. A character that said hard-working and honest, but did not say cheerful or easy in her manner, was a character that told a story between its lines, a character that was genuinely warm, that said she was a credit to any household, or that the writer was sorry to lose her, was something a maid might keep for years, a small tangible proof that her work had been seen and valued. There were women who spent years in service without ever leaving a position on bad terms, who accumulated a series of good characters the way another person might accumulate credentials, and who moved steadily upward through the ranks of the household because their reputation preceded them. The character letter for these women was both a record and a foundation. It was the paper evidence of a working life conducted with care. And so as the years passed and the positions changed and the streets of London shifted around her, different house, different family, different set of bells above a different door, the maid carried her characters with her in the box, the small tight writing of one employer, the more generous hand of another, the particular words that had released her from one life and admitted her to the next. But behind that calm surface, behind the careful letters and the registry offices and the whole careful machinery of reference and reputation, the day came every week that had nothing to do with service at all. One afternoon, brief and bounded, that belonged entirely to her. Every week, if the household was a reasonable one, there came an afternoon that was hers. Not the households, not the families, not available to be redirected by an unexpected visitor or a bell that rang at an inconvenient moment. Her own. The half-day was typically Sunday afternoon, beginning after the midday dinner had been served and cleared, which might mean 1 o'clock or 2 depending on the household, and ending at a specified hour in the evening, usually 9 or 10 o'clock, when the door would be locked and the bolt drawn, and anyone not inside would find themselves on the wrong side of it. This was not a great deal of time, 4 or 5 hours, perhaps 6 if the dinner finished early and the household was generous about the return, and it was bounded on both sides by requirements. The morning still belonged to service, and the evening, from the moment of return, resumed the same. But within that short span of afternoon something shifted. The white cap came off. The black afternoon dress was exchanged for whatever she owned that was her own. She became, for those few hours, not a housemaid, or a parlour-maid, or a kitchen-maid, but simply a woman of roughly 14 to 30 years old, in a city of several million people, with a few free hours, and a small amount of money in her pocket. Until the 1870s, many servants received no regular day off at all. The half-day was a concession that had emerged gradually through the middle decades of the Victorian period, partly as the result of pressure from domestic service reform movements, partly as the practical recognition that servants who were never permitted any rest were not, in the end, better servants for the deprivation. Even in the 1880s, when the half-day had become standard in most respectable households, there were employers who granted it grudgingly or who found reasons to curtail it. An unexpected dinner party, a visitor who needed attending to, a task that could not be left until Monday. A maid who wished to protect her half-day had to be both reliable enough to have earned the employer's goodwill and assertive enough to mention, politely but clearly, that it was her afternoon. What she did with it varied. Many maids went to church, not always from deep personal conviction, though genuine faith was common enough, but also because church attendance was one of the markers of moral character that employers and registry officers valued, and a maid who could be seen regularly in a respectable pew was a maid who was visibly acquiring credit. The Anglican parish churches of Victorian London were full on Sunday afternoons of young women in neat plain dresses who were doing a small amount of worshipping and a considerable amount of social calculation. It was not entirely cynical. The two things, faith and prudence, were not in the Victorian understanding necessarily in conflict. There was also, for many maids, a network of friendship that crossed households. A girl in service in a Mayfair townhouse might have a sister or a cousin in service 2 streets away, or a friend from her village now working in Belgravia. The Sunday afternoon was when these connections were renewed. The two would meet at an agreed corner, walk together to the park or to a tea shop, exchange the news of their respective households, and walk back together as far as their routes permitted. These friendships were sometimes the most sustaining relationships in a maid's working life, more present and more intimate than her connections with her own family far away in the country. The shared experience of service created its own kind of kinship. One day some maids went to the park. Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon in summer was a spectacle of a particular kind. Grand carriages at the top of the social scale, clerks and apprentices in their best coats in the middle, and at the edges of the paths, in pairs or small groups, women in service who had walked from their households in Mayfair and Kensington to sit for an hour in the sun and watch the world go by. It was free. It was peaceful. It was for a woman who had been indoors since before dawn, 6 days out of every 7, a form of restoration that the parks had been designed in part to provide. There were also the cheaper tea shops and refreshment rooms that had begun to appear in central London in the middle decades of the century. For a few pence, a woman could sit at a small table for an hour over a cup of tea and a slice of bread and butter, and be served by another woman, and watch other people through the window. The novelty of being on the receiving end of service, even in this small commercial way, was its own particular pleasure for women whose working lives consisted entirely of providing it. A maid who had spent the week carrying trays to other people's tables now sat at her own and was brought tea and could leave when she wished. Letters home were written when there was paper and a penny for the post. Families who lived in the country waited for these letters with a particular attention. A daughter in service in London was a daughter who was, by most measures, doing well, but she was also a daughter they rarely saw, and the letter was the thread that kept the connection. For the maid who wrote them, the letter was a small act of self-composition, the deliberate shaping in words of who she was and what her life was like, for the benefit of people who loved her. She did not always write the whole of it. Some things were easier left out, and there was walking out. This was the Victorian phrase for the early stages of a romantic attachment, and it described exactly what it said. The couple went out together in public, in a space where they could talk without being observed by their respective employers and without transgressing any explicit rule. The half-day was when this happened, and it happened despite the fact that it was, in most households, officially forbidden. The rule against servants keeping company, against what was usually called followers, a word used in household guides with considerable disapproval, was standard across most households of the Victorian period. A servant who was discovered to have a follower, a young man who came to the back door, or who was known to meet her on her afternoons off, was risking her position. In a strict household, she might be dismissed outright. In a more lenient one, she might be warned and watched. The fear behind the rule was, primarily, the fear of pregnancy and the liability and scandal it would bring upon the household. The practical effect of the rule was that courtship among servants was conducted in the narrow margins of the half-day, out of sight of anyone connected to either household, with a discretion that became second nature. The meeting places were typical. The corner of a particular street in a respectable but not too respectable neighborhood, the edge of a park, the pew of a church, neither of them attended regularly. The walk would be slow and the conversation careful, and the time would pass more quickly than either of them wished, and at the end of it they would part with arrangements made for the following Sunday, and she would walk back to her own household alone, and the man, a footman from another house perhaps, or a clerk in a shipping office, or a soldier on leave, would walk in the opposite direction toward whatever the rest of his evening required. By 9 o'clock, or 10 at the latest, the afternoon was over. She walked back through the streets, past the darkening gardens, and the lit windows and the gas lamps coming on one by one along the terrace, and she came to the back of the house, and the door was unlocked from within by a fellow servant who had stayed behind, and she was back. Her own clothes were exchanged for the uniform. The cap went back on. The house was around her again in all its familiar weight. Tomorrow the bells would ring at 4:30. Tomorrow the range would need its fire. Tomorrow was service, as today had been, and every day for weeks past, and many weeks to come. But for a few hours in the middle of the afternoon, she had been somewhere else. She had walked in the park with her face toward the sun. She had written a letter. She had sat in a church and listened to music that had nothing to do with anyone's dinner. She had been for a little while entirely her own. By the end of the century, in the 1890s, the regime of the half-day had begun to soften further. Some progressive households were granting a full Sunday off in addition to the half-day. Some were reducing the standard working day, or formalizing the wages and conditions of service in writing. The change was slow and uneven, varying enormously from household to household, but it was real. The women who entered service in the 1890s lived under conditions that were measurably less austere than those of their mothers in the 1860s, even as the broader institution of domestic service was beginning, in those same years, to lose its grip on the working lives of young women altogether. And so as the evening settled over the London terraces, and the last of the Sunday light faded from the rooftops, the house resumed its nighttime rhythms, and in every household across the city, the maids who had taken their half-day were back at their tasks, and the half-day was folded away until next Sunday, and the work continued, as it always did, until the very last bell of the night. By 10 o'clock on most evenings, the day was drawing to its close. The family had finished their supper, or the last of their evening entertainment, and the drawing-room was quieting. The candles in the principal rooms had been snuffed. The fire in the library was burning low. One by one, the sounds of the inhabited house were contracting toward the silence of sleep. For the maid, this was not yet the end. There were tasks to complete before she could go upstairs. The kitchen had to be set for the morning. The fire in the range banked, the kettles filled, the breakfast things laid out on the dresser, so that the first hour of tomorrow would not be lost in searching for what was needed. The dining room had to be cleared of the last of the evening things, if that had not already been done. The front door had to be checked. The back door had to be checked. The windows on the ground floor had to be confirmed latched. In a larger household, this final circuit was the butler's responsibility. In a smaller household with fewer staff, it fell to whoever was last to bed, and that was often the senior maid. In some households there had been evening prayers in the dining room before bed, the master of the house reading a short passage of scripture aloud, while the family and the servants stood with bowed heads at the back of the room. This was the practice of the more devout middle-class households, particularly the evangelical ones, and for the servants it added another 10 or 15 minutes to the end of an already long day. By the 1870s and 1880s, the practice was declining in many households, replaced by individual private prayer, but it persisted in some homes well into the end of the century. The maid who had stood through her 1000th evening prayer service knew the rhythms of the readings as well as the family did, and could, in the dark, have said the next sentence before it was read. The banking of the range was a skill that took time to learn correctly. The goal was to reduce the fire to a slow, reliable heat that would sustain the coals through the night without going out entirely, so that in the morning the range could be brought back to working temperature in 20 or 30 minutes, rather than the hour or more it would take to start from cold. You covered the coals with a layer of ash, tamping it down carefully, leaving just enough air circulation to keep the heat alive. A range banked too tightly would be cold in the morning. A range banked too loosely would burn through its coals and need restocking in the small hours. The woman who had done this for months had a feel for it, a sense of the particular temper of the range in that house, which was not always the same as the range in the last house. The candles were rationed in many Victorian households. A servant received a set allocation of tallow candles for the week, perhaps 2 or 3, and when they were gone, they were gone. This was not merely a matter of economy on the employer's part, though economy was certainly part of it. It also served to manage how long servants stayed up, burning candlelight over activities that were not working. A maid who had used her candles sparingly through the week might have a stub left for Sunday night. A maid who had been incautious had none, and went to bed in the dark as soon as her last evening duty was done. The climb to the attic was the last movement of the day. In a 4-story London townhouse, the attic was reached by a staircase that was noticeably steeper and narrower than the back stairs below it, a final ascent beyond the service floors into the very crown of the building where the ceiling sloped toward the roof line, and the air in summer was trapped and stale, and in winter was barely warmer than outside. The housemaid's room was typically at the top of this last flight, a room shared by 2 or sometimes 3 women, with iron beds and rough blankets, and the box bed chests at each foot. The attic room had a quality of remove from the rest of the house that was both its hardship and, in a small way, its compensation. Down below, the house was theirs to maintain but not to occupy in any meaningful personal sense. Up here, at the top, there was a room that was at least their own in the narrow sense that no family member ever came up here, that the housekeeper's inspections were occasional rather than daily, and that the conversation that happened in this room between the 2 women who shared it, in the last few minutes before sleep, in the dark, was private in a way that almost nothing else in the working day was private. When the housekeeper did come, usually unannounced, always carefully observant, she was looking for signs of what the manuals called irregularity, possessions out of place, the bed not made to standard, anything in the room that did not belong to the maid herself, that suggested a follower or an unauthorized visitor or some other transgression of household rules. A well-kept room said, "I know the rules and I follow them." A disordered room said, "I am not entirely the woman the household requires me to be." The inspection was infrequent enough not to feel constant, and frequent enough to ensure that the maid kept her room as if it could come tomorrow. What the 2 women talked about in those last minutes before sleep, the history books do not record. We can only guess from the little that survives, a diary, a letter, a memoir written long afterward, that it was the ordinary stuff of any shared life, the events of the day, the behavior of the family, the small dramas of the servants' hall, the things that had been funny and the things that had been hard, the plans for Sunday, the news from home, the kind of conversation that happens between people who know each other's daily lives with a completeness that has its own particular intimacy, not romantic but close, the closeness of people who have shared walls and bells and cold mornings and the long fatigue of service for months or years. In summer the attic was a different room. The slates above absorbed the heat of the long July day and held it through the night, so that the air in the room was warm and stale even at midnight. The single small window, when it could be opened, brought in only the faintest movement of evening air. The 2 women who shared the room slept thinly, and woke unrested, and went down at 4:30 into a kitchen that had not had a chance to cool. In winter the same room held the cold the way a stone holds it. Frost grew on the inside of the window. The water in the washstand basin had a thin layer of ice in the morning. The blanket on the iron bed was the thickest the household provided, and it was barely enough. The candle, when it was snuffed, left a darkness that was almost complete. The gas lamps of the street below did not reach the attic window. The sounds that came through the slates, rain or wind, or the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the city, were muffled and far away. The last ticking of the clock in the hall below was inaudible from up here. The house breathed quietly around them, its fires low and its rooms dark, and its many rooms and passages and corridors settling toward the stillness of night. Somewhere in the lower part of the house, the long case clock in the hall struck 11. The bell above the door, hanging quiet on its spring, did not move. The fire in the kitchen range, banked carefully an hour before, glowed deep red beneath its covering of ash. The cat that lived in the kitchen, if the household had one, was curled on the rug in front of it. The bolts of the back door were drawn. The bolts of the front door were drawn. The shutters on the ground floor were closed. The keys were on their ring on the housekeeper's writing desk. The household was, for the time being, secure, and the woman who lay in the narrow bed in the attic, whether she had been in service for 1 year or for 20, whether she was 14 or 35, whether this was the first household she had known, or the 5th, felt the weight of the mattress and the rough warmth of the blanket, and let the exhaustion of the day do what it always did at this hour. It released her. It carried her down into the place where the bells could not reach, where the range was always banked, where the white cap was off and the box at the foot of the bed was open, and all the small accumulated weight of the day was, for the next several hours, set quietly aside. She would be up again at 4:30. The bell would ring. The range would need its fire. The water would need carrying upstairs. The day would begin again in the dark, as it always did, as it had done for months and years, as it would continue to do for the foreseeable future. But that was the morning. This was the night. And the night, for a little while yet, was hers. And so as the last lamp in the last room of the house was turned down, and the darkness gathered in the stairwells and the passages, the city outside went on in its own nighttime life. A horse moving slowly in the street below, a distant bell from a church clock striking the hour, the fog settling over the rooftops and the garden squares, and the house that had been so full of motion and work and bells and voices through the long day, was finally quietly still. That is the shape of a day, then, in the world below stairs. Not one particular day, but something assembled from the many thousands of days that 1.5 million women moved through in the years between 1850 and 1880, in the houses that lined the streets of London and the towns and cities beyond it. The range at 5 in the morning, the bells above the door, the white cap put on and the white cap taken off, the wooden chest at the foot of the narrow bed, the half-day and the character letter, and the long climb to the attic at the end of the night. What history tends to remember of the Victorian period is the surface it turned outward, the confidence, the industry, the elaborate social codes, the great public works. What it tends to forget, or to remember only in passing, is the substrate on which all of that rested. The world below stairs was not a footnote to the Victorian world. It was one of its structural elements, as necessary and as quietly present as the foundations of the houses themselves. The women who lived in it were not exceptional. They were ordinary, in the particular sense that they were numerous, and that their work was constant and expected, and largely unmarked. They were also individual, irreducibly so, though the records do not always tell us how. The girl from Norfolk and the girl from County Clare and the girl from the village in Yorkshire were not the same person, and they did not have the same experience of service, and they did not leave it, if they left it, with the same things in their wooden chests. Some of them stayed in service all their working lives, and rose to positions of real authority and found, in the world below stairs, something that was genuinely satisfying. Some of them left as soon as they could, for the factory or the shop or the marriage that took them out of service altogether and never looked back. Most of them lived somewhere between these two accounts, as most lives do, neither the whole difficulty nor the whole compensation, but the ordinary mixture of both. What remains of them is mostly silence, the census record, the entry in a household account, the character letter folded in the wooden chest, which is now gone, but the houses they worked in are still standing, many of them in the streets of London. The back stairs are still there, behind the walls. The bellboard in the ones that have not been too thoroughly renovated is sometimes still there too, mounted above a door in the lower passage, the springs a little stiff, the labels faded, the bells no longer connected to anything upstairs. Let that image settle now. The bells on their board no longer ringing, the fires banked, the house quiet around you from the street door to the slates. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day go. The day is finished, as theirs were finished, and the night is patient. The house is still. The night is long. Let your eyes close. Let the dark come in. Nothing pulls you now. Nothing waits. The bells are quiet.